The night Elinor Vale first laid her hand upon the stranger's shoulder, she believed him to be a servant dismissed for some small failure, and she was herself only one insult away from tears. Highmere House blazed with candlelight, as if the stars had fallen upon its windows. Carriages rolled over the gravel in a glittering procession. Silk rustled across the marble entrance hall. Jewels flashed. Footmen moved like clockwork, and laughter floated from room to room, with the polished brightness of silver being struck. Everywhere one heard the same name in lowered, eager tones. The prince. The prince was expected by week's end. The prince would choose his bride beneath that roof. Lady Maud Ashbourne had spent the last hour making certain her daughter appeared worthy of a crown, and her niece remembered she was not. Elinor stood in the dressing chamber, while her aunt adjusted Cressida's pearls, pinned fresh lace at her sleeves, and complained that the candlelight made nothing look as refined as it ought. When Lady Maud's glance finally settled upon Elinor, it held the cool impatience of a woman examining a chair that had been placed in the wrong corner. "You must lend your blue wrap to Cressida," she said. "It sets off her skin better than yours. And do not wear the moonstone comb. It has a vulgar tendency to draw the eye upward." Elinor had already dressed in the palest gown she owned, a soft silver that had belonged to her mother, and had been altered so often it seemed held together more by memory than thread. At any other house, it might have been called modest. At Highmere, among peacock silks and diamond stomachers, it looked almost apologetic. She unclasped the wrap from her shoulders and handed it over without protest. Habit taught silence faster than pride could teach resistance. Cressida, lovely and flushed with expectation, caught Elinor's wrist before she turned away. "Do not look so tragic. If I become a princess, I shall give you my old gowns." The words were spoken lightly, but Lady Maud laughed as if it were a splendid joke, and that made them cruel. Elinor smiled, because she had long ago learned that humiliation often deepened when one refused to disguise it. "How generous," she said, and the steadiness in her voice cost her more than tears would have. "Stay near the older ladies tonight," Lady Maud added. "No one must imagine you have come to attract notice. You are here because it would have seemed odd to leave you in the country." Odd, not unkind, not impossible, merely odd. Elinor inclined her head and left before the hurt in her face could become entertainment. The corridor beyond the dressing chamber was warm with candle scent and crowded with servants hurrying toward the staterooms, but she took the side staircase instead, then the passage that led toward the old orangery at the eastern end of the house. She had no errand there. She only needed air that had not been breathed by women discussing dowries. Outside, rain tapped softly against the long panes. The orangery had been half abandoned since a winter frost had broken several of its windows years before, yet it remained one of the quietest places in Highmere. In a house prepared for display, neglect had given it mercy. She pushed open the warped door and stepped into dimness, silvered by moonlight and rain. Damp earth scented the room. Bare citrus trees stood in cracked blue tubs, like patient ghosts. Beyond them, on a stone bench near the shattered central arch, a man sat with his head bowed, one hand braced against his brow, as motionless as if grief itself had hardened him into marble. Elinor halted. For a moment, she thought she ought to turn back. A gentleman would not sit alone in a ruined orangery in a plain dark coat, without hat or attendant, as the rain whispered beyond broken glass. He had no jewel at his throat, no embroidered waistcoat, no scent of clove or pomade. His boots were muddied. One sleeve had been brushed by wet leaves. He looked, in that first glance, like a man who had been overlooked by everyone grand enough to matter. Then he lifted his head. Even in shadow there was something arresting in his face. Not beauty exactly, though he had that too in the severe line of his mouth and the striking clarity of his eyes. It was command hidden beneath exhaustion, as if force of will still held him upright when comfort had long since failed. His left hand was bleeding, where a cut crossed the knuckle, bright against pale skin. "You are trespassing upon my misery," he said quietly. His voice was too educated for a servant, yet too stripped of ceremony for the company gathered under that roof. Elinor looked toward the door, then back at him. "Then I beg your pardon," she said. "I only wish to borrow a little silence." Something shifted in his expression. "And have you not stolen it already?" A laugh escaped her before she could stop it, small and unwilling. "I had not meant to be accused in the first minute. Should I wait until the second?" His gaze held hers with a tired intensity that might have been rudeness in another man. In him, it felt more like a challenge thrown out against the dark, as though he had spent too many years being answered with performance. Elinor saw suddenly, with the painful clarity that sometimes comes upon the kind-hearted, that he did not truly wish her gone. He wanted to be noticed and not examined, spoken to and not managed, pitied and not patronized. It was a loneliness she recognized at once because she had worn its shape herself. "You are hurt," she said, nodding toward his hand. "It is nothing. It is bleeding." He looked at the cut as though he had forgotten he possessed a body. "Then the hand is more honest than the rest of me." The strangeness of the answer drew her 2 steps nearer before caution could interfere. She untied the narrow linen handkerchief at her wrist. "If you mean to sit here in the dark, like a tragic ballad, at least allow me to save your coat from stains." He stared at her. Then, astonishingly, he held out his hand. Elinor wrapped the linen around his knuckle, careful and quick. His skin was cold from the night air. The cut had come from the jagged edge of a broken pane. She could see the faint smear of blood on the stone beside him. When she finished knotting the cloth, he did not draw back at once. His gaze had dropped to her bent head, and something in it made her unreasonably aware of how close she stood to a stranger. "You speak very freely," he said. "I did not know silence was required in the orangery." "It is usually required wherever I go." The words were soft, almost careless, yet sorrow moved beneath them like deep water under ice. Elinor straightened slowly. "Then perhaps that is why you came here." He looked at her more sharply. Rain hissed through the fractured arch. From the distant ballroom came the thin echo of violins and a burst of laughter so bright it sounded heartless. "Do you know who is in this house tonight?" he asked. "Too many people who have never been denied anything important." A faint line appeared at one corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "And are you one of them?" "No. You answer honestly." "I was asked plainly." He leaned back against the stone, studying her as though she were the first unscripted thing he had encountered all week. "Every woman under this roof hopes to be admired by a prince she has never met." "Every woman?" Elinor asked. "Nearly." She folded her damp hands together. "Then I suppose I am not nearly enough of a woman to qualify." Something in his face altered again, more fully this time. "No, I do not think that is your failing." She ought to have been offended by such familiarity. Instead, she found herself looking at the line of strain around his eyes, at the rawness he had not concealed quickly enough. "You speak as though you know them." "I know the sort of hunger a crown inspires. And does it inspire yours?" His gaze went to the rain beyond the broken glass. When he answered, his voice had roughened. "No, only everyone else's." The honesty of it moved through her unexpectedly. In that moment, he seemed not mysterious but burdened, and the grandeur of the house behind them only made the isolation in his posture more severe. She sat at the far end of the stone bench without asking leave. "Crowded houses can be the loneliest places," she said. "No one believes a person may be miserable if there are enough candles lit around him." He turned to her then, with an expression she could not at first name. It was not gratitude alone. It was the startled look of a man who had been struck clean through a guarded place. "Who taught you to say such things?" he asked. "No one. I simply listen when rooms begin to tell the truth." "And what does this one say?" She glanced at the empty tubs, the rain tracking down old glass, the broken arch open to the dark. "That someone has been forgotten in it." His breath left him slowly. For one suspended moment, neither of them spoke. The music in the distant wing changed to a waltz. Somewhere in the corridor, a footman passed, his steps muffled. The stranger lowered his gaze to the handkerchief bound around his hand, then back to her face. "My mother loved this room," he said. "Before the house was altered. Before—" He stopped, and the unfinished word hung between them, like a door only half opened. "It is the anniversary of her death." The confession was so sudden and so unadorned that Elinor felt it like a touch. She did not offer the polished condolences that society expected. She had heard too many of them at her father's funeral to mistake them for comfort. Instead, she said quietly, "Then I am glad you were not alone in it tonight." His eyes closed briefly, as if the sentence had cost him more than sympathy would have. When he looked at her again, there was warmth beneath the weariness, dangerous in its gentleness. "And I," he said, "am glad you trespassed." A maid found Elinor a quarter of an hour later and told her Lady Maud had been asking for her in tones that suggested an inheritance had gone missing. Elinor rose from the bench with reluctance she did not understand. The stranger stood as she did, and in the full height of him there was something undeniably formidable, something no shabby coat could diminish. "You should go," he said, "before your absence becomes a crime." She took a step backward toward the door. "Will your hand do? It has already been rescued." She hesitated. "I do not even know your name." For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face, swift and strange. "Tonight," he said at last, "it is enough that you do not." She ought to have found the answer unsettling. Instead, with the rain behind him and the broken room holding his secrets, it felt like a promise that had not yet chosen its shape. She left without pressing him, though the memory of his eyes followed her all the way back to the candle-lit heart of Highmere House. At breakfast the next morning, she nearly dropped the silver coffee spoon into her cup. Lady Maud presided over the table in violet silk. Cressida shimmered in apricot muslin. Lady Sabine Whitcliffe wore sapphire velvet, and the expression of a woman accustomed to inheritance. And at the far end, speaking in low tones to Lord Whitford, the Prince's chamberlain, sat the lonely stranger from the orangery. He was freshly shaven now, his dark hair properly tied, his plain coat exchanged for one of excellent cut, though still unadorned compared to the extravagance around him. He did not look like a servant at all in daylight, nor did he look like any ordinary gentleman. He looked more dangerous, if anything, because refinement only sharpened the authority she had half sensed in the dark. Lord Whitford was introducing him as Mr. Arden, an advisor recently attached to the Prince's household for the duration of the gathering. "His Highness relies greatly upon his judgment," the Chamberlain said. "Mr. Arden will observe arrangements here until the Prince arrives." Observe. The word settled over the table like a second tablecloth. Every woman straightened a little. Every mother brightened. A man trusted by the Prince suddenly mattered more than half the titled guests under the roof. Across the rim of his cup, Mr. Arden met Elinor's eyes. No sign of recognition appeared in his face, yet the barest flicker touched his mouth, too fleeting for anyone else to notice. It was enough to send heat to Elinor's cheeks. Lady Maud caught the glance and frowned. "Elinor, do not drift. Pass the preserves." She obeyed at once. Her aunt spoke to Mr. Arden in honeyed tones. Cressida lowered her lashes at judicious intervals, and Lady Sabine began asking shrewd questions about the Prince's habits, preferences, and devotional routines, as if strategic piety might be fitted to the correct man, like a ribbon to a gift box. Mr. Arden answered very little. He gave them civility and withheld himself so gracefully that his reserve almost looked like modesty. Only once did he speak directly to Elinor. Lord Whitford had mentioned that His Highness greatly valued musical accomplishment in a lady. Cressida declared she played beautifully. Lady Sabine observed that the Prince would require a wife with political intelligence as well as charm, and Lady Maud remarked that true nobility in a bride was shown by submission to duty. Mr. Arden turned to Elinor, who had so far said nothing. "And you, Miss Vale?" he asked. "What do you think a prince requires?" The whole table looked at her as if a chair had suddenly developed opinions. Elinor set down her cup carefully. "Truth," she said. Lady Maud made a soft, displeased sound. "My niece is inclined toward abstractions." "On the contrary," Mr. Arden said. I find that very practical. His gaze rested on Elinor a moment longer than manners allowed. Then he returned to his breakfast, and conversation stumbled before recovering. She ought to have felt triumphant, but a sharper emotion pricked beneath it. He had listened to her in the dark. He had carried those words into daylight and used them as if they belonged to some private understanding between them. That should not have pleased her as much as it did. The prince did not arrive that day, nor the next. Lord Whitford informed the company that affairs of state had delayed His Highness in London, but that his arrival was expected soon. In the meantime, the house party expanded into a theatre of anticipation. Young ladies walked in gardens with studied innocence. Mothers arranged seating like military campaigns. Every breakfast, every musicale, every promenade became a rehearsal for future notice. Elinor had never felt so visible in the wrong ways and invisible in the right ones. Whenever Mr. Arden entered a room, attention followed him at once. He was asked to settle debates, escort parties to the rose walks, inspect new decorations for the ballroom, assess the hunting arrangements, comment upon floral schemes, and explain, when politely cornered, what qualities His Highness most admired in women. He never answered that question directly. Instead, he watched. He listened. He seemed to be measuring something no jeweled hairpin could improve. On the second afternoon, a party went down to the lower gardens, where late roses still clung stubbornly to their trellises. Lady Sabine spoke of court obligations with practiced ease. Cressida laughed too often, and Lady Maud prompted every charming anecdote as though orchestrating a duet in which her daughter must never lose the melody. Elinor walked behind them, with an older countess, whose rheumatism made her grateful for unhurried company. At the sundial terrace, Mr. Arden slowed until he fell into step beside Elinor. "You are not competing," he said softly. She kept her eyes on the gravel path. "Would it disappoint you if I confessed I had no instructions for that? One does not need instructions to desire a throne. One might need more imagination than I possess." He looked ahead, where Cressida had arranged herself in a shaft of afternoon light that turned her hair to burnished gold. "And yet your aunt brought you." "My aunt brings me whenever another pair of hands is useful." The words escaped before she could soften them. For a moment she regretted them. Then Mr. Arden said, very quietly, "That is not the same thing as being unworthy of being brought." The tenderness hidden under the remark struck deeper than flatteries would have. Elinor forced a lightness she did not feel. "You are dangerously charitable for a man assigned to observe." He glanced at her. "Assigned by whom?" "By the prince, apparently. And what if my observations are my own?" She turned then, surprised by the note beneath the words, and found him watching her with a concentration that made the air seem thinner. Before she could answer, Lady Sabine called for him to settle an argument over whether scarlet or white roses conveyed more regal significance, and the moment broke. Yet it stayed with Elinor through dinner and into sleep, where it followed her in fragments she could not dismiss. He saw more than he said. That was the danger. The danger became sharper 3 mornings later in the stables. Cressida had insisted upon riding. Lady Maud insisted that Elinor accompany her to hold spare gloves, smelling salts, and whatever else beauty required in motion. The mare selected for Lady Sabine shied at a dropped currycomb, jerking free of the groom's grasp, and rearing half round with frightened eyes. Ladies shrieked. 2 men lunged and missed the bridle. The horse's flanks trembled, the whites of her eyes flashing. Before thought had time to become caution, Elinor moved. Her father had bred horses when she was a child. He had taught her that fear answered noise with greater fear, but steadied under a quiet hand. She approached the mare sideways, speaking low, palm out, her body calm though the hooves struck sparks off stone. The mare's ears flicked. Elinor reached the neck, stroked once, murmured nonsense as gently as a lullaby, and after 1 taut second, the animal blew out a shuddering breath and lowered her head. "You clever girl," Elinor whispered, taking the trailing rein. "There now." A silence had fallen over the yard. When she looked up, Mr. Arden stood a few paces away, The colour drained from his face. He must have crossed the stable court at speed. One glove was missing, and rain-dark mud streaked the hem of his coat. His eyes did not leave Elinor's. "That was reckless," Lady Maud said sharply, as though bravery were merely another social error. "If you had been kicked, what then?" "Then Miss Vale would have displayed greater courage than anyone else present," Mr. Arden said, taking the rein from Elinor with deliberate care. His hand brushed hers. It was warm now, the cut healed beneath her linen. "Fortunately, the mayor seems to prefer honesty to hysteria." Lady Sabine stiffened. Cressida looked down. Lord Whitford made a sound suspiciously like a cough disguised as amusement. Elinor should have stepped back at once. Instead, she found herself held by the intensity in Mr. Arden's expression. There was admiration in it, yes, but something else too, something fiercer, almost personal, as if the sight of her in danger had offended him on some private level he had no right to claim. "You knew what to do," he said. "My father taught me. He taught you well." It was such an ordinary sentence, and yet the warmth beneath it went through her like sunlight finding a cold room. She withdrew her hand first. "I am glad one of us appears capable," she said. His eyes darkened with a smile he did not permit his mouth. "Do not be so certain about only one." After that, Highmere seemed full of corners that belonged to them without permission. A corridor outside the library, a turn in the yew walk where the wind was less sharp, the music room after the guests had retired and the pianoforte still held the day's last notes. They never sought one another too openly, and yet they collided with increasing frequency, as if the house itself had begun conspiring against restraint. Once, in the library near midnight, Elinor stood on the little ladder, reaching for a volume of verse too high for comfort. Before she could stretch farther, a hand steadied the ladder from below. "You mean to fall dramatically among the poets?" Mr. Arden asked. She looked down and nearly lost her balance anyway. "You move very quietly. A useful habit in houses full of ambition." He took down the book she indicated and handed it up to her. "Cowper," he read from the spine. "Melancholy company. Sometimes the sad poets are the most truthful, or the most theatrical." She climbed down, the book against her chest. "Do you object to sorrow?" "No," he said. "Only to the way society dresses it for dinner." She laughed. The sound startled them both. It came easier with him than with anyone else. She could not remember when that had begun to frighten her more than his silences did. He glanced around the shadowed shelves. "Tell me something, Miss Vale. If you could choose freely, without aunt or dowry or title pressing at your shoulder, what sort of life would you want?" No one had asked her that since her father died. No one. The question struck so cleanly that for a moment she could not answer. "A small house," she said at last, surprising herself with how quickly the image formed. "Windows that open on a garden, a room where one may be quiet without being thought sulky. Enough money not to feel grateful every hour. Perhaps music sometimes, letters that are wanted, and people who do not speak of affection as though it were an expense." He did not answer at once. The candle between them burned steadily, making gold of the leather spines behind his shoulder. "And if a prince offered you a palace?" he asked. She tilted her head. "A palace is only a larger house in which one may be lonely." His gaze changed. "You speak as though you have considered it." "I have considered what becomes of women who are chosen for rooms they have never seen. A girl is taught to call it fortune. Then she discovers it is merely duty wearing jewels. Then you would refuse." She looked at him carefully. "No woman marries a prince," she said. "She marries an institution and is expected to smile at the altar." The words fell between them with the weight of forbidden truth. Something almost like pain crossed his face before discipline gathered it back. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint pale scar near his temple, half hidden by dark hair. "You have an alarming habit," he said softly, "of saying exactly what no one else dares. Perhaps because no one has asked me before. I am asking now, for my opinion, for your honesty." Her breath caught. The library seemed suddenly much smaller, the silence thicker. She told herself he was only a man attached to the prince's household, told herself his attention could not mean what it felt like, told herself many things, and believed none of them. Before either could say more, the door opened, and Lady Maud swept in with a shawl over her shoulders and suspicion in her eyes. "Elinor, there you are. Cressida requires her lavender salts. Mr. Arden, how fortunate to find you occupied in improving my niece's taste." Elinor closed the book before her hands betrayed themselves. Mr. Arden bowed with perfect composure, but when she passed him on the way out, his fingers brushed the cover once and turned it so that she later found a line marked inside in pencil, too lightly for anyone else to notice. To see the heart plain, one must first strip it of ceremony. She stared at the words until her vision blurred. That evening, Cressida sang in the music room before half the assembled guests. Her voice was sweet, if uncertain, and Lady Maud watched the audience as avidly as a general counting surrendered flags. Halfway through the second Italian air, the accompanist, an elderly viscountess with delicate nerves, was taken unwell. Conversation fluttered, embarrassment rose. Cressida stood frozen, one gloved hand pressed to her pearls. Elinor crossed to the pianoforte before Lady Maud could hiss her name. "I know the piece," she said. Cressida stared. "Do not ruin it." But Elinor had already seated herself. Her fingers found the keys with familiar ease. Music had been the one language in which she had never needed permission to feel. She began softly, then fuller, as Cressida gathered courage and joined in. By the second verse, the room had stilled. Candlelight swam across gilt frames. Voices ceased. Even Lady Sabine's fan did not move. When the song ended, applause rose at once, warm for Cressida, surprised for the accompaniment, and edged with something that made Lady Maud's smile brittle. Elinor stood to leave the instrument immediately, not wishing to seem to claim any part of the attention. As she turned, Mr. Arden was waiting beside the pianoforte. "You rescued more than the song," he said. "It needed only someone to begin. That is often the harder part." His voice had dropped to a tone meant for her alone. She looked up and found open admiration in his face, unguarded for one dangerous heartbeat. It was enough to make the room tilt slightly. Cressida arrived then, cheeks bright with success, and accepted several compliments meant in equal measure for herself and the evening's fortunate recovery. Yet later, when the guests had gone in to supper, she paused beside Elinor in the corridor. "You should have let me fail," she said, not unkindly, but with a wounded pride that was near enough. "Now everyone will say I was saved. I would rather they say that than remember your humiliation." Cressida's expression wavered, revealing for an instant the frightened girl beneath the beautiful one. But she gathered herself at once. "You always sound noble when you mean to make others feel small." Elinor stared after her, hurt settling where satisfaction had been. Even kindness could be twisted in certain hands. She should have known better than to expect gratitude where comparison had taken root. She went out again that night, drawn by restlessness she could not confess. The orangery was empty. Rain no longer fell, but the air held the scent of wet stone and roses. As she turned to leave, a voice came from the shadowed arch. "I wondered if you would come." Mr. Arden stepped into the moonlight. He wore no coat this time, only shirt sleeves and waistcoat, as though he too had escaped the suffocation of polished rooms. The sight of him in such ease sent a pulse through her she had no business feeling. "You speak as if we had an appointment," she said, though her voice was not entirely steady. "Did we not? I was not informed of it. Then I must improve my methods." She should have laughed and gone back inside. Instead, she remained by the cracked blue tubs while he came nearer. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said, "It was here my mother was happiest at Highmere, before court swallowed every room she entered. She once told me this orangery felt more honest than the palace, because dying leaves cannot pretend to be in bloom." Elinor touched the edge of a weathered planter. "She sounds like a woman who preferred truth to spectacle." She preferred kindness to both. His jaw tightened. It did not save her. The rawness in the sentence stripped away all the charm of their previous exchanges. He had carried grief for years, she understood suddenly, and not only grief, but anger at a world that had made use of it. There was something almost boyish in the wound, preserved beneath the discipline of a man. "What happened?" she asked quietly. He looked at the dark arch beyond her shoulder. She married where she was told. She smiled where she was expected. She learned too late that velvet can line a cage as effectively as iron. By the time anyone noticed she was lonely, they called it delicacy and prescribed more company. A chill moved over Elinor that had nothing to do with the night air. She thought of queens in portraits, their throats covered in pearls, their eyes curiously empty. "She died of an illness?" she asked. "She died," he said, "of never once being allowed to belong to herself." The words were so low, she almost missed them. He had not meant to say that much. Perhaps he knew it and could not take it back. Elinor did not offer platitudes. Instead, she moved nearer until only an arm's length stood between them. "Then I am sorry for the boy she left behind," she said. His whole face changed. Not softened exactly, but stripped of one more layer of armor. "You speak of him as though he still exists. Does he not?" He looked at her for such a long time that she felt the answer pass unspoken between them. Yes, and no one had asked after him in years. A breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Beyond the broken arch, moonlight silvered the yew walk. He said at last, "What if I told you that I am expected to choose a woman before the week is done? A woman who will stand in rooms full of people and never once say what you said tonight. Then I would tell you not to choose her." He gave a low, almost incredulous laugh. "With what authority?" "With the authority of anyone who has watched a life become a duty and called it sorrow." Something blazed behind his eyes, sudden and dangerous. He reached toward her, then stopped before touching. "Elinor." It was the first time he had spoken her name. The simple sound of it in his voice made her heart stumble. She should have corrected him. She should have reminded him they were not friends, that he had no right to close the distance between them with a single word. But the moonlight, the cracked glass, the confession half-breathed into darkness, all of it had made rules feel thin. "If you are wise," she said, very softly, "you will leave this room before you say something that cannot be unsaid." His mouth curved without amusement. "What if I am tired of wisdom? Then you are in greater danger than I am." He stood very still. "I begin to suspect that is true." The next morning, Lord Whitford found him alone in the small study overlooking the east lawn, standing at the window with a sealed packet in his hand and an expression that made the Chamberlain look suddenly older. "Your father sends word again," Lord Whitford said. "Lady Sabine is still considered the most suitable alliance. Her uncle controls half the votes your reform requires." "I know her uncle," Adrian said without turning. "I would not trust him to choose my horse. Marriage and trust are rarely invited to the same table." Adrian looked over his shoulder then, and the Chamberlain, who had known him since boyhood, saw at once that something irrevocable had shifted. The old disgust remained, but it no longer stood alone. "I have chosen," Adrian said. Lord Whitford straightened. "Then I shall inform the king that you incline toward Lady Sabine." "No." "Lady Cressida." Adrian folded the letter once. "No." The Chamberlain's brows rose. "Then who?" But Adrian only looked back toward the lawn, where, in the distance, Elinor crossed with a basket over one arm, moving toward the servants' wing, because one of the maids had taken ill, and Lady Maud found such errands beneath her daughter's notice. "I will tell him," Adrian said, "when I have told her." He had not meant to let the disguise last so long. That was the truth he admitted to no one. It had begun as resistance. When the king demanded he attend Highmere and select a bride from the assembled daughters of families useful to the crown, Adrian had agreed only on the condition that he arrive first, unannounced, and see the women without the machinery of ceremony surrounding them. He wanted, he had said, to observe. What he meant was, he wanted proof that all the hunger aimed at his title was not a hallucination born of old wounds. He wanted to stand where no one knelt. He wanted one conversation in which his name did not enter first, and truth flee after it. Then Elinor had come into the orangery with hurt hidden under composure, and had bound his bleeding hand with a scrap of linen, as if mending pain required no audience. After that, concealment stopped feeling like strategy and became temptation. With her, he could ask what he had never been permitted to ask. With her, he could hear what women thought of crowns when they believed no crown was listening. With her, he could feel, for stolen minutes at a time, like a man who might still be chosen for the part of him untouched by rank. He knew it was unjust. He knew every day that deepened the deception made the revelation crueler. Yet each time he resolved to speak, she would look at him with that grave, candid gaze, and selfishness would whisper that one more hour mattered, one more walk, one more conversation in which she did not already belong to the prince she imagined. By the time he understood he had crossed from curiosity into love, it was already too late to reveal himself without causing pain. Lady Sabine understood quicker than most people when attention had shifted away from her. She cornered Elinor that afternoon beside the rose walk, where the last blooms were losing petals to the wind. The sun had gone pale behind clouds, and the gravel path was empty, except for a gardener far off among the trimmed hedges. "You have been much in favor lately," Lady Sabine said, twirling her parasol, though no sun required it. "It is astonishing what novelty can do for plain features." Elinor kept her face smooth. "I was not aware I required astonishment." "Do not be tiresome. We both know what game is being played." "No," Elinor said, "I do not." Lady Sabine's smile thinned. "Men like Mr. Arden are sent to measure us. Some ladies answer with pedigree, some with wit, some, apparently, with moonlit sympathy in ruined rooms." Ice went through Elinor. "I do not know what you mean." "Then you are either innocent or accomplished. I have not yet decided which is more irritating." Before Elinor could answer, Cressida appeared at the bend in the path, her expression tight. She dismissed Lady Sabine with brittle courtesy and waited until the other woman had gone. "You must be careful," Cressida said at once. "Mama says people are beginning to talk." "About what?" "About you and Mr. Arden, of course. You are forever disappearing into corners, and he is forever looking as if the room improves when you enter it. Men should not make such mistakes where princes are concerned." The injustice of the remark struck Elinor almost harder, because it came from Cressida, who had once shared midnight whispers and hair ribbons with her in childhood before adulthood taught comparison. "He speaks to many people," Elinor said. "Not as he speaks to you." The words hung between them. Cressida's eyes shone, not with malice exactly, but with hurt vanity and something more frightened. She had built all week around expectation. To see preference tilt elsewhere, even toward a woman who supposedly did not matter, wounded more deeply because it made hierarchy uncertain. "I never asked for his attention," Elinor said. "No," Cressida replied. "That is why it is worse." She walked away before Elinor could answer. A moment later, Lady Maud's voice sounded from the terrace, sharp as a knife on crystal, summoning Elinor indoors. That evening, humiliation wore a fresh face. Lady Maud waited until they were alone in her sitting room, then closed the door with deliberate care. "Whatever foolishness you have encouraged with Mr. Arden must end immediately." "I have encouraged nothing." Lady Maud's nostrils flared. "Do not lie to me. I know very well what overlooked girls begin to imagine when a gentleman is civil. You forget your position." "My position has never been in doubt," Elinor said, before caution could stop her. Lady Maud stared, surprised by the edge in her voice. "Then remember it. If you embarrass Cressida at this house, I will send you home before breakfast." Home. The word landed like mockery. There was no home to send her to, only the old dower cottage now leased to strangers, and the memory of parents buried under churchyard grass. Lady Maud seemed to hear the cruelty only after speaking it, but pride prevented retreat. "You owe us gratitude," she said more coldly. "Do not repay kindness with ambition." Elinor looked at her aunt and thought, with a calm so bitter it almost tasted sweet, that gratitude was always the coin demanded by those who gave least freely. She bowed her head, because open rebellion would only strip her of what little independence she possessed. Yet inside, something had begun to harden. She went to the portrait gallery after dinner because there was nowhere else to put her wounded dignity. The room was empty, save for ranks of dead Ashbournes watching from gilded frames with expressions of hereditary disappointment. Firelight leaped softly over varnish. She stood before a portrait of a long-ago countess who looked both serene and trapped, and wondered what percentage of history had been painted over women's fear. "You disappear when you are angry," Adrian said from the doorway. She turned too quickly. He had come without warning, as though he belonged in every room. Perhaps he did, she thought suddenly and strangely, not because he was important, but because his presence altered the air itself. "I was not aware my temper required an audience," she said. "It does not. But your sorrow should not require solitude." The gentleness of the answer pierced the armor she had been rebuilding all evening. She looked away. "Your household appears to have inspired more conversation than comfort." "My household? You, Lord Whitford, the Prince, the whole machinery of scrutiny. Every woman here feels watched. Some are merely better pleased by it." He came nearer, stopping beneath the portrait opposite hers. "And you? Are you displeased by my notice?" The question was too direct, too warm, too dangerous. "I am troubled by it," she said, and that was the truth. "Because of your aunt. Because of myself." His breath changed. "Elinor?" "No," she said quickly, turning to him. "You do not understand. When a person has spent years being useful, she grows suspicious of being seen. One begins to wonder whether notice is merely another form of amusement." The words were harsher than she intended. Pain flashed across his face so swiftly she almost missed it. "I would never amuse myself at your expense." The force beneath the sentence shook her. They stood only a few feet apart now, candlelight wavering between them, old painted faces looking on. "Then tell me what this is," she whispered. He looked as if the truth had rushed to his lips and struck a barrier only he could see. His hand tightened once at his side. "When the time comes," he said at last, voice low and strained, "will you hear me?" The answer disappointed her more than anger would have done. Still hidden, still withheld. "Everyone deserves one truth told plainly," she said. "I think I deserve that much." His gaze dropped, then rose again with quiet desperation in it. "You do." He might have said more then. She felt it. But in the corridor beyond the gallery, trumpets sounded, and a servant's voice carried through the hall. "Message from London. His Highness arrives tomorrow evening for the grand ball." Everything changed at once. The house exploded into preparations, so feverish that by afternoon even the flowers seemed arranged in ranks of expectation. Footmen polished silver until it flashed like water. Cooks shouted below stairs. Seamstresses ran pins through hems as though sewing reputation itself. Every lady under the roof studied herself with heightened severity, as if beauty might be improved by panic. Elinor saw almost nothing of Mr. Arden that day. When he did appear, it was in motion, conferring with Lord Whitford, giving instructions to servants, examining decorations in the ballroom with an expression too grave for mere flowers. Twice their eyes met across crowded rooms. Twice he seemed about to cross to her. Twice some demand intercepted him. By evening, a new ache had taken shape inside her. Tomorrow the prince would arrive. Tomorrow Mr. Arden's role as observer would end. Whatever strange, illicit current had grown between them would vanish beneath ceremony, and perhaps that should have relieved her. Instead, she felt as if some inward shore were already giving way. Lady Maud placed Elinor in a gown more faded than silver and less flattering than pearl, claiming the stronger colors must be reserved for Cressida. "Stand near the Dowager Countess after the first set," she instructed. "No one must mistake you for a candidate." "I am not one," Elinor said. Her aunt gave a thin smile. "Exactly." The ballroom glittered. Hundreds of candles burned in the crystal chandeliers, turning the polished floor to liquid gold. Music swelled from the gallery. Ladies shone like jeweled blossoms. Gentlemen lined the walls in black and white and silver braid. When Elinor entered behind her aunt and cousin, conversation seemed to rise and break around the room in waves of excitement. She looked for Mr. Arden at once and could not find him. The absence startled her more than it should have. She told herself it meant nothing. He would be attending upon the prince. He would not waste time searching a ballroom for a woman who had no place in its politics. Yet as the first country dance began, and then the second, and still he did not appear, an unreasonable emptiness spread beneath her ribs. Then the doors at the far end of the room were thrown open. Trumpets rang. Lord Whitford's voice carried clear and ceremonial. His Royal Highness, Adrian, Crown Prince of Valmere. Every head turned. Every body bowed or curtsied. Elinor lowered her eyes because all the room did, because the movement was expected, because she was suddenly afraid without knowing why. When she looked up, the world stopped. He stood beneath the chandeliers in dark, formal uniform threaded with silver, the star of Valmere brilliant at his breast, a ceremonial sword at his side. Yet no jewel, no braid, no posture altered the face she knew. The same severe mouth, the same pale scar near the temple. The same eyes, God help her, the same eyes that had looked at her across the broken arch of the orangery while rain whispered beyond the glass. Mr. Arden had vanished because he had never existed. A roaring filled Elinor's ears. Around her, ladies sighed, mothers brightened, gentlemen bowed lower, but she could not feel the floor beneath her feet. She saw only the prince descending the short dais, accepting formal greetings, speaking to Lord Whitford, then lifting his head, as if tugged by something far more urgent than ceremony. His gaze found her across the room. Recognition passed between them, with such naked force that several people nearest noticed and fell silent. He did not disguise it. He did not even try. In the next breath he was moving toward her, court parting before him like water before a blade. Lady Maud's fan dropped. Cressida went white. Lady Sabine's mouth tightened into a line of polished disbelief. Adrian stopped before Elinor and bowed, not to Lady Maud, not to Cressida, to Elinor. "Miss Vale," he said, and her name in his real voice carried through the silence like a hand laid upon bare skin. "I owe you the first truth." No one in the room breathed. Elinor curtsied because years of training accomplished what shock could not. When she rose, she made herself meet his eyes. Hurt struck against recognition, affection against betrayal, tenderness against humiliation. All of it flashed so quickly she could not sort one wound from another. "You owe me more than that, Your Highness," she said. The title cut. She meant it to. His face tightened, as though the blow had landed physically. "Yes," he said, "I do." A murmur went through the room like wind through dry leaves. Lady Maud looked close to fainting from a mixture of horror and hope. Lord Whitford seemed to contemplate the ceiling as a man might, who has long since accepted that fate dislikes him personally. The prince held out his hand. "Will you walk with me?" There was no refusing him without spectacle. There was no accepting without one. Elinor saw both abysses and stepped into the lesser, only because she could still carry her spine upright. She placed her hand in his. The touch, so familiar and so transformed, nearly undid her. He led her not onto the dance floor, but through the side doors to the moonlit conservatory beyond the ballroom, where palms cast long shadows over marble, and the music reached them only as a distant pulse. The moment the doors closed behind them, she took back her hand. "You let me comfort you," she said, and the steadiness of her voice astonished her, "while you stood there pretending to be no one." He looked as though he had rehearsed this scene and found every prepared word useless. "I never pretended to be no one, only not who others would hunt. You let me speak freely because you wished to hear what I would say to a lesser man." "No," he said fiercely. "I let you speak freely because I could not bear another conversation arranged around my title." She laughed once, very softly, and there was no joy in it. "How fortunate for you. You acquired sincerity at no cost to yourself. That is not true, is it not?" Her hands shook. She clasped them tighter. "You asked me what I thought of princes. You asked what sort of life I would choose. You let me pour out truths I would never have offered had I known who stood before me. I know. His voice roughened. I know, and I was wrong. The admission did not soothe. It only made the injury cleaner. Was I amusing then? Instructive? Did I answer well enough for the test? Pain flared across his face. Do not say that. Why not? Was that not what this was? A prince in disguise, measuring hearts while keeping his own hidden. I stopped measuring the first night. Silence struck them both. He had moved closer without her noticing. Candlelight from the ballroom touched one edge of his face. Moonlight silvered the other. He looked less like a prince now than a man cornered by his own regret. I came here intending suspicion, he said. I found you instead. Every day I meant to tell you. Every day I waited for one more hour in which you looked at me and saw only a man. And you had no right to it. No, he said. No, he said. I had none. If punishment were enough to restore what I damaged, I would accept it gladly. She wanted anger. Anger was clean. Anger would have spared her the humiliating ache of still knowing the cadence of his voice, still remembering how gently he had spoken her name in darkness when she had believed him no more dangerous than herself. But betrayal did not kill tenderness at once. It left it breathing under the wound, and that was worse. In the orangery, she said, when you spoke of your mother, was that truth at least? His face altered, hurt giving way to something solemn. Every word, and when you asked me what life I would choose, I wanted to know it because I had begun, by then, to fear I wanted to be in it. Her breath caught, despite herself. She hated that he could still do that to her. Hated more that the pain in his voice did not sound rehearsed. But truth arriving late has a cruelty of its own. It does not heal the lie it follows. It only proves the lie was unnecessary. She took one step back. You should have trusted me with your name before you trusted me with your sorrow. I know. You keep saying that, because there is nothing clever enough to defend me. At another time the answer might have softened her. Tonight it only deepened the grief. Then do not defend yourself. He bowed his head once, as if accepting sentence. Very well. From the ballroom came the rising swell of a new dance. Somewhere beyond the palms a door opened and shut. The world continued while hers rearranged itself around one brutal truth. The man she had pitied, challenged, and nearly loved had all along been the very prince whose imagined choice had filled the house with calculation. He had come not merely in disguise, but in judgment. What happens now? She asked, and the quiet of the question frightened her more than tears would have. His eyes lifted to hers. For the first time since entering the conservatory, there was no prince in them, only a man stripped of every useful shield. Now I tell them I choose you. The room seemed to tilt. No. The word came before thought. His expression tightened. Elinor, no. She steadied herself with effort. You do not mend deception by making me a spectacle. If you say such a thing tonight, every person in that ballroom will believe I angled for it. My aunt will call it triumph. Lady Sabine will call it strategy. Your court will call it folly. And I... Her voice thinned, but she forced it steady again. I will never know whether you mean to honor me or absolve yourself. He did not answer at once. That pause told her he understood the justice of the blow. In that, at least, he had always been honest. He listened where others defended. What would you have of me? He asked at last. The saddest part was that she knew. Not title, not immediate declaration, not even apology, though she had bled for one. What she wanted could not be ordered by royal whim. Truth without power behind it, she said. Something given freely, where refusal remains possible. His face changed at that, grief mingling with admiration so unguarded it almost undid her. You ask, he said softly, for the only thing no one ever asks of me. Then perhaps it is the thing you most need to learn. A knock sounded at the conservatory doors. Lord Whitford's voice, carefully neutral, carried through the panel. Your Highness, The king's minister has arrived unexpectedly from London. He begs a private word before the supper interval concludes. Adrian shut his eyes briefly, as though the kingdom itself had developed a talent for inconvenient timing. When he looked at Elinor again, regret stood stark in his face. I must go. Yes, but this is not finished. It was a prince's way of speaking, and for the first time she heard the habit clearly. Expectation dressed as certainty. Her chin lifted. It may be finished for me. The sentence landed harder than any shouted accusation. He drew breath as if to answer, then stopped. Perhaps something in her expression warned him that pursuit now would be one violence more. He bowed, not ceremonially, but with a grave humility she had never seen him show any room full of people, and went. Elinor remained among the palms until the music blurred and the candles beyond the glass became smears of gold through tears she would not let fall until she was alone. But Highmere House had no mercy for private suffering. By the time she returned to the ballroom, the air already vibrated with speculation. She felt eyes turn. Lady Maud intercepted her before she reached the wall. "What have you done?" her aunt hissed, smile fixed for observers. "He walked out with you before the whole room." "I did not ask him to. Do not be insolent. If this ruins Cressida—" At that, something within Elinor that had bent for years without breaking finally straightened. She looked directly at her aunt. "If this house has taught me anything," she said in a low voice, "it is that I have spent too long apologizing for things I did not cause." Lady Maud went still. Shock, not outrage, showed first. Elinor had never spoken to her that way. Perhaps she herself had not known she could. Cressida stood a little farther off near a column, pale and miserable under all her shining hair. When Elinor approached, she saw at once that her cousin's pride had suffered a blow too public for vanity alone. It was not easy to watch hope collapse, even when that hope had so often been sharpened against her. "I am sorry," Elinor said. Cressida gave a small, brittle laugh. "For what? That the prince prefers wounded sincerity to polished obedience? It seems the lesson was always there. I simply did not think it would punish me for learning the wrong one." The bitterness in it was real, but so was the pain. Elinor softened. "I never wished to take anything from you." Cressida looked at her for a long moment, then away. "No," she said quietly. "That may be why he looked at you." Before Elinor could answer, Lady Sabine glided near, all composure and sharpened silk. "What a remarkable evening," she murmured. "Some women spend years acquiring consequence. Others stumble into it through moonlight and modest gowns." Cressida flushed. Elinor, exhausted beyond fear, met Lady Sabine's gaze steadily. "And some women," she said, "believe consequence can only be worn if no one else is permitted dignity." For the first time since their acquaintance began, Lady Sabine's mask slipped. Not much, only enough to show real irritation before she recovered and drifted away, with a smile too polished to be sincere. The supper interval ended. The prince returned to the ballroom with ministers and noblemen at his shoulder and state in every line of his posture. He did not look at Elinor again in public that night. That restraint hurt more than attention would have done. It told her he had listened. It told her he understood spectacle would wound her further. It also told her that power, once resumed, was not easily laid aside. At dawn, she asked for paper. Her room at Highmere overlooked the east lawns, silver with early mist. Below, gardeners moved like shadows. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang for chapel. Elinor sat at the little escritoire beneath the window and wrote with a hand steadier than her heart, "My dear aunt, I thank you for your hospitality. An urgent indisposition obliges me to return to Ashbourne Cottage at once and spare the house further inconvenience. Pray do not trouble to dissuade me. Your affectionate niece, Elinor Vale." It was not wholly a lie. Pride can become a kind of illness when one stays too long where it is unwelcome. She sealed the note before courage altered. Then she packed the few gowns she owned, the book from the library with the penciled line in it, and the handkerchief he had stained with blood, and she had never washed. That last, she nearly left behind. Instead, she folded it into the smallest pocket of her valise, furious with herself for sentiment, even as she could not bear to part with the evidence that the first night had been real. By 8 o'clock she was in the old travelling carriage, Highmere reserved for inconvenient departures. No one came to stop her. Lady Maud sent a maid with extra shawls and a message that repose in the country might indeed be best. Cressida sent nothing. Lord Whitford arrived only as the groom was fastening the door. He bowed low and passed up a sealed note. "His Highness begs that you read this," he said quietly. "I do not," Elinor replied, though her hand shook taking it. The carriage rolled away before she opened the seal. The paper inside was brief, the writing firm and unmistakable. "I will not command your return. I will not excuse what I did. But if distance is the only honest gift you will accept from me today, then I will give it, though it costs me more than any crown has yet required." She read it twice and hated the tears it brought, because even now he heard her. Even now he answered not as prince, but as the lonely man in the orangery. Love, she discovered, does not become simpler when trust is damaged. It becomes cruelly double. One part aches toward the beloved, the other braces against him. Ashbourne Cottage had once belonged to her grandmother, and now stood half-let, half-neglected, at the edge of a village 2 hours from Highmere. A tenant family occupied the larger western rooms, but the housekeeper still kept 2 chambers for occasional Ashbourne use. They were the chambers Elinor had known as a girl, with faded curtains and the scent of lavender trapped in wood. When she stepped inside, something in her chest loosened and hurt at once. Here, at least, no one measured how useful she appeared. Days passed, then a week. Rain came and went. The lane grew rutted. Villagers brought late apples and gossip. Mrs. Hobb, the old housekeeper, observed without intrusion that Elinor ate little and slept less, then quietly increased the tea and placed fresh flowers on the window ledge, as if sorrow might mistake beauty for invitation and leave. From London came rumour enough to reach even the village inn. The prince had not announced his bride. Court factions were restless. Lady Sabine's uncle was said to be displeased. The king had recalled several advisers. No one knew whether the choice had been delayed or abandoned. Elinor tried not to ask. She failed by listening too carefully whenever a cart from town passed through. One afternoon, while helping the vicar's wife sort blankets for a fevered family near the mill, Elinor learned from the same loose tongue that Lady Maud had returned early from Highmere and was in very low spirits. Cressida had received fewer offers than expected. Some said the prince's conspicuous attention to a poor relation had cast ridicule on the entire house party. Others said he had quarrelled with several powerful men. Still others claimed he meant to marry beneath politics or not at all. That last rumour stayed with Elinor into the night, where she fought it like temptation. He had not come. Perhaps that was mercy. Perhaps it was wisdom. Perhaps he had already been bent back toward duty and had decided, after all, that one honest woman was not worth a kingdom's displeasure. The thought should have protected her. Instead, it opened a fresh wound. Then came the letter. It arrived sealed with the Ashbourne crest, not the royal one. Lady Maud's hand covered the direction. Elinor broke it by the parlour fire with sudden unease. "Elinor, you are required at Highmere immediately. Lady Cressida's engagement to Mr. Julian Fenwick will be announced within the fortnight, and several matters concerning your late father's papers have arisen in the attic inventory. There is also some talk in the county which your presence may help quiet. I expect you by Thursday." Aunt Maud Elinor read the letter twice, suspicious of every line. Her father's papers. The attic inventory had been ignored for years. Yet if there were documents of his, accounts, leases, perhaps even the small investments once spoken of and later dismissed, she could not in prudence refuse to come. For a woman with no fortune, a forgotten paper might alter the whole edge of survival. So on Thursday she returned. Highmere looked different under grey skies, less like a stage set, more like the ancient house beneath its own vanities. Cressida's engagement to Julian Fenwick, a handsome and sensible gentleman with moderate fortune and no imagination, was indeed the chief topic below stairs. Lady Maud greeted Elinor with chilly necessity. Julian, when presented, bowed kindly and seemed honestly fond of Cressida. That ought to have comforted Elinor, and almost did, until she saw how brittle her cousin's smile remained. As for the supposed attic papers, they were real enough. Trunks had been opened. Old ledgers lay stacked in dust. Yet by evening, it became plain that Lady Maud had exaggerated their urgency. There were letters, household receipts, a sheaf of hunting notes in her father's hand, and one sealed packet bearing his name from a London solicitor long dead. Elinor carried that packet to her room with trembling fingers. Inside, she found copies of correspondence proving that, shortly before his death, her father had placed a modest sum into trust for her maintenance. Small by noble standards, but enough to free her from complete dependence on relatives. The trust had never been claimed. The solicitor had died. The matter had vanished into neglect or convenience. Either way, the money was hers by right. She sat on the edge of the bed staring at the figures, until anger rose through the astonishment. Lady Maud had likely never known, but someone had failed her. A system built by men had misplaced the difference between gratitude and autonomy and expected her to live by the lesser forever. For the first time in months, hope came not as dream, but as fact. She had scarcely absorbed it when a maid knocked in distress. "Miss Vale, please come. Lady Cressida is unwell." Cressida was not merely unwell. She was weeping in the little blue morning room, her engagement ring lying untouched on the table beside her. Lady Maud stood over her in alarm and annoyance, the way ambitious women often do when feeling refuses schedule. "What nonsense is this?" Lady Maud demanded. "Mr. Fenwick is respectable, agreeable, perfectly suitable." "Yes," Cressida cried. "That is what terrifies me." Lady Maud turned as Elinor entered. "Speak to her. She has become absurd." Elinor crossed at once and sat beside her cousin. "Tell me." Cressida pressed both hands to her mouth before words escaped between them. "I do not want him. You liked him yesterday. I like him now. He is kind. He will never wound me on purpose. But I do not want to marry him while wondering whether my whole life has been chosen because I failed elsewhere." Lady Maud made an impatient sound. "Failed? You have secured an excellent match." Cressida lifted her tear-bright face. "That is exactly the cruelty of it, Mamma. Everyone says excellent when they mean acceptable. I thought if I dazzled enough, if I pleased enough, if the prince looked at me once with real feeling, then perhaps I should know I was not merely the most convenient daughter in the room." The confession silenced them. For one aching instant, Elinor saw her cousin not as rival, but as another woman, shaped by expectations so constant they had become atmosphere. Beauty had not saved Cressida from fear. It had only hidden it more prettily. Lady Maud's expression faltered. "You are overwrought." "No," Cressida whispered. "I am tired." Elinor took her hand. "Then do nothing tonight. No announcement, no answer. One evening's delay will not ruin a good man, and if he is truly kind, he will prefer your honesty to your submission." Lady Maud looked scandalized. "You cannot mean to advise further uncertainty." "I mean to advise truth." The old word again. It seemed to follow Elinor everywhere now, asking a price. Lady Maud drew breath to object, then stopped, perhaps because even she could see that force would only drive her daughter deeper into misery. At last she said stiffly, "Very well, until tomorrow." When she had gone, Cressida clutched Elinor's hand with an urgency from childhood. "Did he ever speak to you as if you were the only person in the room?" The directness of the question stole Elinor's breath. She could have lied. Instead, she answered with equal honesty. "Yes." Cressida closed her eyes. "Then I am glad, at least, that it was not empty attention. I think I could have borne disappointment better than pity." Something hot and sudden burned behind Elinor's eyes. She squeezed her cousin's fingers. "You deserved better than comparison, and you deserved better than being told gratitude was your dowry." When Cressida said it, shame and love braided strangely through the words. It was not quite apology, but it was the beginning of one. That night, the house was roused by shouting in the outer court. A horse, lathered and wild-eyed, had come hard from London. The rider carried dispatches. Half the servants whispered before the first candle was lit. The king had taken ill after a parliamentary dispute. Several ministers were already maneuvering to secure influence over the expected succession of authority. The prince was at Arnsley, his smaller estate, receiving delegations and refusing immediate announcement of any marriage. Arnsley lay less than 12 miles from Highmere. Elinor slept hardly at all. In the morning, Julian Fenwick arrived pale but composed, received Cressida's request for delay with more grace than Lady Maud deserved, and asked permission to walk in the south garden. There, to Elinor's quiet surprise, he said, "I would rather marry a woman who chooses me slowly than one who sacrifices herself quickly." Cressida stared at him. Some fresh respect entered her expression. Not love, perhaps, not yet, but something steadier than performance. By noon, a second rider came. This one bore no royal seal. He carried only a folded note for Miss Vale and would not say from whom. Elinor opened it in the library with a pulse already too quick. "If I come to Highmere, I make you a spectacle again. If I stay away, I leave power in others' hands. Meet me at St. Cyprian's Chapel at dusk, if you can bear to hear the rest of my truth. If you cannot, burn this, and I will trouble you no more." A St. Cyprian's stood half a mile beyond the yew avenue, on the edge of the old deer park, a small family chapel of grey stone and worn saints, seldom used except for Ashbourne memorials. He had chosen it carefully, neutral ground, as much as any place near Highmere could be. She should not go. Every argument against it arrived promptly. He was still a prince. He still had power she did not. One meeting could reopen every wound. And yet not going would not close them. It would only leave them half-healed, which is another name for raw. At dusk, she slipped from the side door in a plain cloak and walked alone beneath trees already losing leaves to autumn. The sky had gone pearl and iron. Rooks crossed overhead. By the time the chapel came into view, her heart was beating so hard she felt it in her throat. He was waiting outside, bareheaded, in a dark riding coat without insignia, no escort, no herald, no sword at his side, only Adrian. When he saw her, something like relief and pain crossed his face together. "Thank you for coming. I have not yet decided whether that is wisdom or weakness. Neither have I." The answer almost drew a smile from her, and that frightened her more than reproach would have. He opened the chapel door and stood aside. She entered first. Inside, the little sanctuary smelled of old stone and wax. Evening filtered through narrow-colored glass, painting faint bruises of blue and red across the floor. A single lamp burned near the altar. They stood in the aisle, where generations had knelt, to ask heaven for sanctioned versions of human longing. "You said there was more truth," she said. He nodded slowly. "My father intends that I marry where policy profits most. Lady Sabine's family is part of that design. When I came to Highmere, I meant to prove to myself that every woman presented there would greet rank before character, and thus make obedience easier. Instead I found a woman who comforted a stranger because he looked lonely." His voice dropped. "Do you know what that did to me?" She said nothing. "It made cynicism feel cowardly. It made duty feel like surrender. It made me understand, for the first time since my mother died, that marriage need not be a polished form of grief." He drew breath. "I loved you before the ball. That is not an excuse. It is only the truth. I was too slow to honor properly." Her hands tightened within her cloak. To hear the words spoken plain should have satisfied some hunger. Instead it hurt, because love confessed late still bears the shape of delay. "And what do you expect me to do with that truth now?" "Anything you wish." He stepped closer, but not too close. "Refuse me. Condemn me. Tell me I mistook gratitude for love. Tell me I do not know my own heart. I will listen. But do not believe I sought amusement or experiment. I sought refuge in being unknown, and found instead the only person before whom I wished to be fully known." The chapel grew very still. Elinor looked at him, the man who had deceived her, yes, but also the man who had listened when no one else did, who had remembered her father's lessons because she once calmed a frightened mare, who had marked a line in a book because he understood how she thought, who now stood without entourage in an empty chapel asking not obedience, but judgment. "I do not know how to trust you," she said at last, and the vulnerability of it nearly undid her. His eyes closed briefly. "Then let me earn it, not through promises that rank can enforce, through choices it cannot." "What choices? You are a prince. Your every step has witnesses." "Not every step." His mouth tightened. "I can refuse an alliance. I can withstand my father's anger. I can relinquish the convenience of a silent bride. I can protect your name, even if I lose any claim upon your affection. And if the cost of loving you is to hear no from you and still do what honors you, then that too I can do." She wanted to believe him. That was the danger. Love makes faith feel virtuous long before it becomes safe. Before she could answer, the chapel door burst open. Lady Maud stood framed against the dimming sky, one hand gripping the panel, her face white with outraged triumph. Behind her loomed Sir Benedict Vale, Elinor's father's elder cousin, a hard man with a harder mouth, summoned from Bath only 2 days earlier upon hearing of the prince's attention and smelling advantage in the air. "So it is true," Lady Maud breathed. "Secret meetings, in the chapel." Sir Benedict's gaze went from Elinor to Adrian and sharpened at once into calculation. He bowed, but badly. "Your Highness, I had not expected to find my young kinswoman conducting negotiations with such admirable privacy." Elinor felt the blood leave her face. "There are no negotiations." "Not yet," Lady Maud said, recovering enough composure to turn vicious. "But there will be, if common sense survives romance. Elinor, you have gone far enough. You will return with us at once." Adrian's whole posture changed, not dramatically. He did not raise his voice, but authority moved through him like steel, sliding free of velvet. "Miss Vale came here under my written request," he said. "Any blame is mine." Lady Maud seized on the words. "Then let it be repaired, Your Highness. The house has already endured whispers. If you mean honorably, speak to the king and settle the matter. If not, I must insist my niece's reputation be guarded by other means." Other means. The phrase chilled the chapel. Sir Benedict stepped forward. "Miss Vale possesses, as it happens, a modest inheritance question. Legal uncertainties. A woman's prospects are fragile things. I would hate to see confusion arise where a clear arrangement might spare everyone embarrassment." There it was. Blackmail dressed as family concern. Elinor went cold with fury. "My inheritance is my own affair," she said. Sir Benedict ignored her. "I presume Your Highness understands that, once a lady's name and royal favour appear together in county conversation, some settled provision becomes the gentleman's natural duty." Adrian looked at him with such perfect stillness that Sir Benedict's confidence flickered. "You presume," Adrian said softly, "that I do not recognize extortion because it arrives in gloves." Lady Maud paled. Sir Benedict flushed dark red. "I speak only of protection." "You speak," Adrian replied, "of converting a woman's dignity into leverage." The words struck like slaps. Elinor saw, with a strange, fierce clarity, that he was angrier on her behalf than on his own, not because his pride had been challenged, but because they had tried to use her. Something inside her, long braced against being chosen out of guilt or convenience, shifted. Lady Maud's mouth trembled with a dozen calculations at war. "We are her family." "No," Elinor said quietly, and all three turned to her. "You have housed me. That is not the same thing." The sentence hung there, simple and irrevocable. She stepped forward, not toward Adrian, but into the space where her own life had too long been discussed by others. "I have spent years accepting correction, comparison, obligation, and the daily reminder that gratitude was expected where affection was optional. I will not be bartered now merely because a prince has looked my way." Lady Maud stared as if seeing a stranger. Sir Benedict's jaw tightened. Adrian did not move, but in his eyes she saw something brighter than admiration, something like awe, and it steadied her further. "My father left me a trust," she continued. "I learned of it yesterday. I am no longer dependent enough to be bullied, which I suspect will disappoint some of you." Sir Benedict blanched. Lady Maud's lips parted. The news had outrun neither greed nor management. For once, surprise belonged to them. "I shall return to the house tonight only to collect my things," Elinor said. "After that, I will go where I am not treated as useful furniture. If Mr. Fenwick remains good enough to marry into this family, let him at least do so among honest people." Cressida's voice came from the doorway behind her mother. "Then I may as well join honesty now." They all turned. Cressida stood there breathless, her hair half loosened by haste. Julian Fenwick just behind her, with the bewildered patience of a man who had followed a storm because he cared where it landed. Cressida came down the aisle until she stood beside Elinor. "Mamma," she said shakily, "if you make one more arrangement, as though my heart were a sideboard to be placed where it shows best, I shall refuse Mr. Fenwick out of pure principle, though he deserves far better than that." To Julian's credit, he only bowed his head as if acknowledging the justice of being discussed by honest women. Lady Maud sank onto the nearest pew as though her bones had suddenly remembered mortality. For the first time, Elinor pitied her. A life spent arranging appearances had left her defenseless before truth. Sir Benedict, however, recovered enough to sneer. "Very stirring. Yet speeches do not alter the crown. If His Highness defies the king for a woman of no strategic value, the whole court will eat her alive," Adrian answered before Elinor could. "Then let the court discover it has sharper teeth than I." It was not loud. It was not theatrical. That made it all the more formidable. Sir Benedict opened his mouth, thought better of it, and bowed himself out in offended haste. Silence remained behind him. Lady Maud sat rigid, one hand at her temple. At last she said, without looking up, "Leave me." Cressida stared, hurt and love warring visibly in her. Then she obeyed, taking Julian's arm. Elinor followed them to the doorway, but Adrian's voice stopped her. "Elinor." She turned back. In the half-dark chapel, with all pretense stripped away, he looked younger and more tired and more royal than ever before. "I will not ask you to answer tonight," he said. "You have defended yourself enough for one evening." The gentleness of it nearly undid her. She nodded once and left. What followed moved faster than rumor and slower than healing. By the next afternoon, the king's condition had worsened, not unto death, but enough to require Adrian's immediate return to London. He came to Highmere only long enough to speak privately with Lord Whitford, offer formal respect to Lady Maud, who received it like a woman drinking medicine she disliked but dared not refuse, and request one final moment with Elinor in the East Garden. They met beneath the yews where autumn had begun to thin the leaves. "I go to London now," he said. "There will be pressure from every side. Some of it will be ugly. If your name is spoken publicly, I will defend it. If it can be spared public mention, I will spare it. And what of Lady Sabine's alliance? It is finished unless I revive it. I will not." She searched his face. "And if your father commands otherwise?" A shadow crossed his mouth. "Then for the first time in my life, he will hear me refuse." The quiet certainty in that sentence carried more weight than any vow flung grandly at her feet. She believed he meant it. The question was whether the world would allow the meaning to matter. "You should not build your future upon me," she said softly. "Not until you know whether I can forgive what you did." He looked at her with a sadness so tender it hurt. "I am not building upon certainty. I am standing inside hope." Her breath shook. He drew a glove from his pocket and unfolded it. Inside lay her linen handkerchief, laundered but faintly stained where blood had once marked it. "I kept this," he said. "I told myself it was because it reminded me that one evening I had been spoken to like a man. In truth, I kept it because it smelled of rain and courage, and because I had already begun to love the hands that tied it." She took the handkerchief, unable to speak. "I do not ask you to keep faith for me," he said. "Only this. Do not decide, in my absence, that I loved you as a prince plays at weather. I loved you in the ruins before I ever wore the star before you." Then, because wisdom had finally reached him where impulse once ruled, he did not try to kiss her. He bowed, touched 2 fingers briefly to his heart, as if acknowledging where she now remained, and went. Winter came early that year. The king recovered enough to survive, though not enough to command every quarrel. Parliament pressed, courtiers whispered. Newspapers, with their thinly veiled allusions, hinted at an unnamed lady from a country house gathering who had complicated a diplomatic marriage. No name appeared. True to his word, Adrian had kept her from becoming entertainment. Elinor left Highmere before the first frost and took lodgings in Bath, where her recovered trust income, after much correspondence and the startled assistance of her late father's old agent, allowed a modest independence. She rented 2 rooms overlooking a narrow square, taught music to 3 merchant daughters, read by her own fire, and learned the difficult relief of making decisions no one corrected. Letters came from Cressida, at first cautious, then warmer. Julian had proposed again after honest delays, not from triumph, but from growing affection. This time she accepted with tears and laughter in equal measure. Lady Maud, chastened if not transformed, had become quieter. That alone felt like a miracle. No letters came from Adrian. At first, the absence cut. Then it began, strangely, to heal. He had promised not to press her while her answer remained uncertain. Perhaps this silence was another form of honor, painful but deserved. Yet sometimes, when snow whitened the rooftops and the world seemed reduced to firelight and breath on glass, she would wonder whether hope could survive too much restraint. In February, Bath received a royal delegation. The city bloomed with gossip overnight. The Crown Prince, acting with increasing authority during the king's fragile health, would attend a charitable concert for war widows, speak with local magistrates, and inspect certain reforms in hospital provision. Elinor learned all this from Mrs. Penford, her landlady, before the second kettle boiled. She told herself it meant nothing. Then on the evening of the concert, one of her pupils fell ill, and Mrs. Penford begged Elinor to deliver a packet of copied music to the assembly rooms where the organizers waited in confusion. Wrapped in plain wool and more irritated than composed, Elinor crossed the snowy square and entered the crowded back corridor just as 2 gentlemen rounded the corner. One was Lord Whitford, the other was Adrian. Time did not stop so much as narrow to the width of one breath. He wore dark formal dress, no uniform, but power moved with him now more openly than before. Something in his face had sharpened over the winter. Responsibility had drawn cleaner lines at the mouth. Yet when he saw her, all public composure vanished in one astonished, unguarded look that belonged wholly to the man from the orangery. Elinor, her name in his voice sent warmth and ache through her at once. Lord Whitford, with the tact of a man who had spent a lifetime escaping emotional explosions in corridors, took the music packet from her hands, bowed, and disappeared, as if swallowed by statesmanship. For a moment, neither moved. "You look well," Adrian said, and the simplicity of it carried more feeling than compliment ever could. "So do you," she answered, though it was only half true. He looked stronger and more tired, and infinitely dearer than safety advised. Snow melted from her cloak hem onto the polished boards. From the ballroom beyond came the tuning of strings and the low hum of assembled guests. "I did not know you were in Bath," he said. "You were not meant to." Something like rueful understanding touched his face. "Have I still so little right to find you?" She might have answered coolly. Instead, she found herself exhausted by pretense. "I do not know what right you have, only that I have thought of you too often for comfort." He drew breath sharply, as though the confession had struck him clean through. "Then I am selfish enough to be grateful." She almost laughed, though her eyes burned. "That is not the most noble answer. I have been noble for months. It has not improved my happiness." The old warmth flickered between them, painfully familiar. He took one step nearer. "May I speak plainly? You have learned at last that I prefer it. His gaze held hers. I have done what I said I would do. I refused the alliance. I endured my father's anger. I protected your name. I have not written because every letter I drafted sounded like pressure dressed as patience. But there has not been one morning since Highmere when I did not wake already missing you. The corridor blurred for a moment. Elinor looked down because otherwise she might have wept in public and hated herself for it. I was angry, she whispered. More than angry, I was ashamed of how much you mattered to me before I knew who you were. I know. And then I was ashamed that knowing did not stop it. At that, he moved as if instinct dragged him forward, but he stopped just short of touching her. Elinor, there is nothing shameful in having loved a man before his title entered the room. If anything in our story is clean, it is that. She closed her eyes. Those were the words she had not known she needed. Not apology, not vow. Recognition of what had been real before injury distorted it. When she opened them, he was still there, still waiting, not claiming. I do not forgive easily, she said. Then do not forgive easily. You might be miserable. I am already miserable. The question before us is whether misery must remain my permanent residence. The absurdity of it drew from her a laugh wet with tears. He looked at the sound as if it were sunrise after a winter campaign. There is something else, he said, quieter now. I have asked no one since that night in the chapel. I will ask you, and I will accept whatever answer you give. Not as prince, not as inheritance, not as remedy for scandal, only as Adrian, who loved you first in the dark when you thought him poor company and still stayed. Her whole body stilled. Will you allow me to court you openly, he said, until you know whether your heart can choose me with full knowledge and still call it freedom? Not marry me, not choose now, court you openly. He had listened all the way down to the root. He was offering time where power would once have offered decision. It was such a simple mercy that it broke the last resistance pride had mistaken for protection. Yes, she said. The word left her almost as prayer. Something in him gave way. Not dignity, never that, but the hard-held strain of months. His eyes closed once, briefly, as if relief required darkness to pass through. When he looked at her again, the tenderness there was so vast she had to steady herself against it. Yes, he repeated, like a man afraid hope had learned to mimic sound. Yes, she whispered, smiling through tears. But if you ever test my heart again, I shall make certain you regret surviving it. His laughter came low and astonished, full of warmth she had only heard in fragments before. That, he said, is the happiest threat ever laid upon me. He still did not touch her until she gave the first sign, only the smallest movement of her hand from her cloak. Then he took it carefully, as though it were something returning by grace, not entitlement. His thumb brushed the place where once she had tied linen around his wound. The memory passed between them like light. I have one more truth, he said. Only one, for tonight. His gaze softened. When you said in the library that a palace was only a larger house, in which one might be lonely, I thought then that if ever I had a home worth entering, it would be because you had crossed its threshold. The words undid her completely, not because they were grand, because they were quiet and exact and rooted in the part of her that had always wanted a small house with wanted letters and affection not treated as expense. And if I still prefer windows opening on a garden, she asked unsteadily. Then I shall build state enough around the garden to satisfy ministers and spend the rest of my life being grateful you required no larger miracle. The concert bells rang. Voices gathered beyond the doors. Duty called. For once it did not feel like the enemy of tenderness, only its impatient witness. Spring transformed everything. He came to Bath first in discreet intervals, walking with her in the Crescent, under proper supervision so the city might see no scandal in their attachment, only the astonishing seriousness of a prince who listened more than he spoke. He met her pupils and was mocked gently by them for turning pages too slowly. He carried blankets to the widow's hospital when no one important was watching. He stood with her at the pump room and let old women stare until they grew bold enough to bless them both. With each visit, he became less symbol and more beloved man, though power never vanished entirely. It simply ceased to be the first truth. She went to London in May. Court glittered no less fiercely than Highmere had, but she entered it differently, not as tolerated relation, not as decorative possibility, but as a woman who had already once walked away and could do so again. That knowledge steadied her. So did Adrian's quiet devotion. He never left her exposed. If conversation turned cutting, he redirected it. If curiosity sharpened toward cruelty, Lord Whitford appeared with miraculous timing and a talent for suffocating gossip beneath protocol. The king received her at St. James's with frosty intelligence and an old man's wounded pride. He had wanted alliance, strategy, certainty. Instead, his son had brought him a woman with no political advantage and too much honesty to flatter. Yet even he could not entirely resist Elinor's calm dignity. She answered questions plainly. She did not simper. She did not tremble. By the end of the audience he had not softened precisely, but he had ceased looking at her as an accident. Cressida married Julian in June, beneath roses and forgiving weather. Lady Maud wept so much that half the congregation decided maternal tenderness had always been her deepest trait, and the other half pretended to believe it. Elinor stood beside her cousin, who squeezed her hand before the vows and whispered, "If I had become a princess, I would have been unbearable. It is much kinder of fate to make me merely happy." Julian laughed when told of this, and looked, to Elinor's quiet relief, exactly like a man who found truth more attractive than perfection. By August, Adrian asked the question that had hovered for months in every glance. They were at Arnsley, the smaller estate where he had gone during the winter crisis. Unlike the palace, it breathed. The windows truly did open on gardens, wide lawns sloping to a lake, old beech trees, a walled rose court where evening gathered slowly. They walked there after supper, while swallows turned above the hedges and the last light burned gold on stone. "I have learned patience," he said. "Do not ask anyone at court to confirm it. They would lie out of jealousy." She smiled. A dangerous boast. A deserved one. "I have waited through snow, Parliament, 3 bishops, and your refusal to let me rescue even one trivial difficulty. You were very solemn about a broken latch. It offended me personally that a house should dare inconvenience you." She laughed, and he stopped beneath an arbor heavy with late roses. The humor left his face then, replaced by something steadier and deeper. "But there is one thing," he said, "on which I no longer wish to practice patience if you are ready." Her heart knew before the words. "Marry me, Elinor." No kneeling spectacle, no audience. No jewels produced with theatrical timing. Only Adrian before her in the evening light, eyes steady and vulnerable, and full of the love that had survived deception by being forced to become honest. "I cannot offer you a small life," he said quietly. "I wish I could, if only to spare you pain. But I can offer you a life in which you are never again asked to shrink to fit another person's ambition. I can offer you truth, once hard-learned and now fiercely kept. I can offer you a home where loneliness will not be mistaken for decorum if I have breath enough to notice it. And I can offer you the certainty that I loved you before you ever knew I was worth fearing." Tears rose at once. She did not hide them. He had earned that much honesty from her. "When I first met you," she said, "I thought you were a man no one had noticed. In fairness, I had gone to some effort." She smiled through tears. "And now all the world notices you. A great inconvenience. I recommend obscurity whenever possible." Her hand found his. "Then hear my truth plainly, Your Highness." His brows lifted. "That title is usually a warning." "It is, a little." She drew breath. "You wounded me. You frightened me. You made me feel seen and deceived in the same heartbeat. But you also listened when no one else did. You changed when it would have been easier to command. You gave me time where power might have taken consent by exhaustion. I do not know whether love should survive such a beginning." His fingers tightened around hers. "But mine did," she whispered, And because it did, and because you learned to deserve what you first obtained wrongly, yes, I will marry you." For one suspended instant he simply stared, as if joy too large for belief required translation. Then he exhaled a laugh that sounded half like relief and half like prayer. He did kneel then, not for spectacle, but because feeling overcame form, and pressed his forehead briefly to her hand before rising and drawing her into his arms. When he kissed her, it was not the triumph of a prince who had won. It was the reverence of a man received after being forgiven only in part and loved in full. All the delayed tenderness of rain-dark rooms, library silences, chapel confessions, winter restraint, and spring devotion seemed to gather there and become one answer at last. Their wedding took place in early autumn, when the air was mild and the gardens at Arnsley still held roses. The king attended with grave acceptance. Lord Whitford looked permanently 10 years older and entirely satisfied. Cressida cried before Elinor did, then laughed at herself and ruined 2 handkerchiefs. Lady Maud, subdued by time and correction, embraced her niece with awkward sincerity and whispered, "I did not know how much wrong can hide inside ordinary arrangements." It was not perfect repentance, but it was real. When the vows were spoken, Adrian looked at Elinor with the same astonished gratitude he had worn in the Bath corridor when she first said yes to courtship. Perhaps that was what made the moment feel inevitable rather than grand. Not destiny descending in fanfare, but truth arriving late and at last staying. Justice came in smaller, sweeter forms than revenge. Sir Benedict's attempt at quiet leverage reached the ears of the wrong legal men and ended with his embarrassment in 3 counties. Lady Sabine married a marquess who admired her pedigree and never noticed when she was lonely, which Elinor would not have wished on any woman and yet could not prevent. Cressida, freed from chasing rank as proof of worth, discovered she loved Julian's steadiness more each month because it was chosen, not performed. Lady Maud learned, awkwardly and without elegance, to ask rather than arrange. As for Elinor, she found that palaces could indeed become larger houses in which one might be lonely, but only if those within mistook ceremony for care. She and Adrian refused that mistake whenever they could. The orangery at Highmere was restored at his request, not into glittering perfection, but into a warm glass room with winter jasmine, lemon trees, and a stone bench left exactly where it had been. On the first anniversary of their marriage, they visited it in rain. He touched the bench and smiled. "Here is where I first realized I had no defense against you." She looked around the repaired arches. The candle lanterns hung discreetly among leaves, the soft tapping of rain against whole panes now mended. "Here is where I mistook a prince for a lonely stranger." "You were only half mistaken." She turned to him. In maturity, his face had not lost its gravity, but joy lived in it now more openly. He had become a wiser ruler because he was less interested in being obeyed and more interested in being known. The kingdom praised his reforms. Ministers called him unexpectedly human, as though the quality was startling in a crown. Elinor privately thought it was the only quality worth crowning. "I think," she said, "the lonelier truth is that you were both." He took her hand and kissed the place where once she had tied linen around blood. "And you," he said softly, comforted both of them. Outside, rain silvered the garden paths. Inside, the old room glowed with warmth and leaf shadow and memory repaired into blessing. She leaned against him and listened to the weather on the glass, no longer a sound of secrecy, but of shelter. Years later, people would tell the story differently. Courts always do. Some said the prince had disguised himself to test the vanity of brides. Some said he had chosen a woman of hidden virtue over rank. Some said romance had overturned politics. Some said politics had merely bowed to better judgment. None of them got it entirely right. The truest version was simpler. A woman who had been taught to make herself small entered a ruined room because she needed somewhere quiet to hide her hurt. There she found a man, burdened by a greatness that had never once made him less lonely. She offered kindness before she knew it was dangerous. He loved her before he knew how to deserve it. She demanded truth where others would have accepted splendor. He learned that love offered without freedom is only another decorated prison. And when at last he chose her, he did not choose a bride for a crown. He chose the only woman who had ever looked at him in the dark, seen the wound before the title, and stayed.